welcome everyone to the lecture on the Boston Congress of Public Health Review Editorial Fellowship, Designing Exceptional Reviews for Academic Manuscripts. And just as a reminder, so we do have a 16-week participation schedule that is in effect. Please be notable to the groups that you'll be in, groups A and B, and then when we will be having different lectures, such as the one that we're having now, as well as when you'll actually be doing group reviews with your group. So agenda for this session, we'll be going over again the importance of peer review in academic publishing, understanding the peer review process in general, as well as how it pertains to the Boston Congress of Public Health Review, and then going over what's it like to be a managing editor, an associate editor, as well as a reviewer. So as we remember, the importance of peer review in academic publishing. So unlike publishing academic manuscripts where there is no peer review, a peer review process really allows for people to say that this manuscript has gone through a rigorous process and every aspect of it has been thoroughly vetted by peers within the field, obviously within our particular field, those within public health, social justice, as well as adjacent fields as well. And that every aspect of the manuscript has been thought of carefully in terms of its validity, its accuracy, its originality, its creativity, and its overall ability to contribute to the overall literature and the discourse within public health, social justice, and intersecting issues. And so the importance of the peer review, it's really for all of you to help ensure that academic research maintains its integrity, right? So we have that critical lens of peer review to be able to uphold that honesty and authenticity of qualitative as well as qualitative research, as well as the op-eds that we see as well. And we really want to be able to ensure that our peer review process is trustworthy, that it's transparent in how we're doing it, and that it's rigorous. As I said before, everything from the abstract, the introduction, the research methodology, the results sections, the discussions, the conclusions, as well as any appendices, are all rigorously vetted, as well as the references are from reputable sources within the last 3 to 5 years and are most representative of the field. And so from the managing editing standpoint, if you are the managing editor, your job is basically deciding that you have the precision and the oversight to make sure that the guidelines for BCPHR or any other journal that you're working with are actually being followed. And these are very important to ensure that all academic manuscripts are streamlined. So making sure that the formatting everywhere of the different headings and subheadings that we require, the formatting of tables and figures, as well as the formatting of the references are appropriate, and so on. As an associate editor, you're really deciding, does this manuscript fit within the scope of the journal, the public health, social justice, health equity, and health justice? And then as the academic peer reviewer, we're looking at, is this research truly groundbreaking? And if not, is it contributing somehow to the discourse within public health, social justice, health equity, as well as health justice? Do our reviewers have a dedication and a level of expertise and scrutiny? Obviously, as the co-editors in chief, we make sure that we've chosen all of you to be able to have that. But as you go on, potentially to work in other journals or to establish your own journals, these are things that you'll be thinking about in terms of what you want to have in your reviewers, and then obviously what your managing editors to be looking for, as well as your associate editors. So as reviewers, right, your job is to maintain that research quality. As you're critically evaluating given manuscripts, you're assessing them on their validity, the research methodology that they chose, and the significance of the research that they chose to include in their literature reviews. You're ensuring that that integrity of the manuscript is identifying and being able to eliminate those errors, any biases that might result, to skew the perception of the results, as well as the discussion, any ethical concerns in terms of how the research may have been conducted. It's also to provide constructive feedback. And so these are actionable insights. So things that the author can actually do, and be very mindful that there are times when the research cannot be reconducted. So there are times when the grant funds have run out or there's not enough time in terms of being able to publish this within a certain window of time. And so provide feedback where they can actually make changes to the manuscript. And sometimes these may not be things that they can go back and make changes to the actual research methodology itself. And if that's the case, as a reviewer, you could mention that recommendations are made for the research methodology, but if there's such a huge difference in things that need to be done for the actual conducting the research, that might not be a paper that we want to accept overall. The other thing as a academic peer reviewer, you want to make sure that you're gatekeeping for relevance. We are a public health, social justice, health equity, health justice journal. And so when we accept manuscripts, we have to make sure that they are falling within those buckets and not just necessarily within public health, because we definitely do get manuscripts that come into this area, but we want to make sure that we're covering these other aspects because we are democratizing public health through the lens of social justice. So we do want manuscripts that cover those other aspects of health equity and health justice as well, and that we're having impactful and original research. And we're making sure that we have the best practices in terms of how the research is being conducted and whether or not it's done ethically. So understanding the peer review process in a nutshell, and you'll see that this lecture is purposely redundant with previous lectures, as well as aspects within this lecture itself and then prior. We want to make sure that we really firmly ingrain these principles within you of being on the editorial board, but then also as a peer reviewer. So you'll be downloading manuscripts and then reading them from Scholastica, which is the peer review center that we have all of our manuscripts come into. Now, you may note not all academic journals will use Scholastica. They may not actually even use a system like that. They may still be operating with either Google Docs or Excel, but we happen to have a management system that makes it much easier to be able to not only acquire manuscripts, but then also to quickly review them within a certain period of time and then send them off for revisions, acceptances, and or publications, and in some cases, rejections. And you're addressing each aspect of the manuscript separately, from the abstract, the introduction, the methods, the discussion, the figures, the tables, the references, and even the positionality of that, and then looking at the biographies as well. You're providing that balanced, constructive feedback. So you're offering praise on the things that they do well, so to be able to show that you agree with the things that they've done, and then the things that they need to improve, things that they can be able to improve within the next couple weeks up to a month. If there are things that you recommend that cannot be done within a month, it's probably not very actionable research, actionable improvements. The other thing is making sure that it's balanced as well. So it's not entirely all praise and it's not entirely all negative and improvement focused, but it's balanced, it's positive as well as negative. And it's making sure that the references that are done for the manuscript are complete and up to date. Are there things that you may know of in the literature that are not being referenced, and these things are pivotal or seminal to the research that they're doing for HIV, for maternal and child health, etc.? Are they within looking at references within the last 3 to 5 years? And then looking at the figures and tables, are these as clear as they should be? Are they as digestible as they should be? Can more figures and tables be added? Can some be deleted? Can some be embedded within the manuscript or moved to different appendices? And also, when you're looking at the discussion and the conclusion, can we have a stronger or more balanced discussion of other research that's been done before, the strengths of the actual research that's represented in the academic manuscript, the limitations of the research that they've done, and then also what are the implications for further research policy and practice, not within just their own work, but within the field itself. So this is just a revisitation of the editorial process at the Boston Congress of Public Health Review. So step one, authors submit their article through our publication portal known as Scholastica. The article is reviewed for its meeting our guidelines by the managing editor. We make sure that it aligns with our submission protocols. If it does not, it is desk rejected, and that means it's no longer reviewed at that point. It doesn't go any further in the process. However, we do have a policy that they can make changes and submit an entirely new manuscript. However, the manuscript as is cannot be redone. It has to go through the whole process of resubmission. If, however, it passes the managing editing stage, it goes on to the associate editor who decides whether or not the manuscript fits into the overall scope of the BCPHR, which obviously, as I said before, it's not only just incorporating public health, but health equity, health justice, social justice. And at that point, it goes to a minimum of 2 reviewers if we're doing a regular campaign, or it goes to 1 reviewer for doing an expedite, but we'll get into those specific details depending on if it's a regular submission cycle process versus an expedite submission cycle process. Reviewers then look at the manuscript and they do it all the aspects that I mentioned before, looking at abstract, introduction, research methodology, discussion, references, figures, and tables, and then they're making a decision. Do I want to accept, reject, or recommend a revise and resubmit at that time? And then they're using the rubric that we have in BCPHR to not only give anywhere from 1 to 4 stars, make that recommendation for accept, reject, or revise and resubmit, but then also provide substantive information around aspects about the originality, the clarity, the coherence, and the implication of that particular manuscript to the overall public health and social justice discourse. It's then passed back to the associate editor. If it's accept, then the associate editor is the one who goes ahead and actually accepts the manuscript. Obviously, the co-editors in chief are all CC'd in all of this, so they are privy to all of that. If, however, there's a need for a revision and resubmission, it's sent back to the author. The author usually has anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks to be able to incorporate all of that, and they then have to fill out a number of things to not only show what they've actually incorporated into their revisions, and that's resubmitted, but they also present the revised version with the track changes, as well as a revised version without the track changes. And the associate editor is able to see both of those aspects to see exactly what has been incorporated to be able to then decide, do I now accept or do I reject because it's still not acceptable with the level of revisions. If there's an issue where reviewers differ on whether or not they want to accept, reject, or revise and resubmit, then there's a bit of arithmetic or calculus, if you will, where the associate editor has to decide, well, do I have one reviewer that's saying accept and one saying revise and resubmit? I might decide to err on the side of revise and resubmit. However, if I have a split where one is saying accept and one saying reject, then I, at that time, may decide that I want to go ahead and have more reviewers come on, so I can go ahead and split that and see like where I fall on. Is it more of an accept or versus a reject? After the decision is made to be accepted, it then can go to publication, and we actually now are using Scholastica to be able to their background and all of their staff to be able to do the final copy editing and the official publication. So that is not something that we do in-house anymore. And then ultimately, authors are informed whether or not they have been published and get a chance to look at their published manuscript. So, as a reminder of what we had last lecture, what makes an exceptional review of an academic manuscript? It is timely. And timely for an expedite review may be that the manuscript is reviewed within 2 to 4 days from the time that it hits the reviewer's desk. That might also be that it's reviewed within 2 weeks if it's during a regular submission. So being timely and not waiting on that, because authors need to be able to get that research out within a timely fashion. And so not being able to do that within an overall scope of 6 to 8 weeks for the journal is impeding research that needs to go out for that author and the teams. It's also clear. It's easy to read and interpret. It's not too short, but it's not too dense to where the author and the authors have to wade through it. But it's easy to understand what is the praise, what are the things that I need to be able to improve on and take action upon, and things that I can do that are within my purview. And it's helpful, it's relevant, and it's realistic in terms of things that could be incorporated within the references, things that might be incorporated in terms of the figures and tables, as well as appendices, as well as how arguments can either be strengthened and or omitted if they're actually diluting the overall manuscript. And then finally, reviews are comprehensive. As I mentioned before, they're not just focusing on the discussion or the research methodology, but all aspects of the actual article to be able to provide the best possible advice to the author or authors. So managing editor as a review. So in a nutshell, if you're a managing editor, what are you doing? You're looking at the guidelines and you're placing them side by side the manuscript that you're editing for, and you're determining, do they follow what I want for the cover letter? Do they follow the formatting of the references, the tables, the figures? Do they have all the headings and subheadings? Do they have a positionality statement, et cetera, et cetera? Then you're checking for plagiarism, and we'll give you some tools for that. And then you're scanning for overuse of AI. We no longer have a 0% AI use. However, it is within reason, and we've settled upon anywhere from 10 to 15%, give or take, plus or minus 5%. But looking at all of those tools as a managing editor to make sure that it's meeting the guidelines for the Boston Congress of Public Health review, that there's no aspects of plagiarism, and that there's not overuse of AI, so that we can determine that, in fact, it is original manuscript that's being submitted. And the guidelines, you can go on BCPHR. Each different type of manuscript type has a different guideline. So a qualitative manuscript versus a quantitative manuscript versus an op-ed, etc., will be different. So you'll have to download these different guidelines for the different types to be able to see exactly what we're looking for. And this not only includes the BCPHR guidelines, but also guidelines that are needed on Scholastica's end, so that they're able to format that by their standards. They do have particular standards. So as a managing editor, you have to be very rigid and by the book about this, because if they are accepted for publication and then they're sent to Scholastica and they do not follow Scholastica's ultimate formatting, it will be sent back. And ultimately that will cause just more time and effort on the editorial board's side, as well as for the author to be able to have to edit things which they thought was actually already done. So that's why the managing editor is exceptionally important in being sure that these guidelines are met and enforced, and desk rejecting when necessary before they actually pass a manuscript through that doesn't actually need to go through to the associate editor. So I mentioned before, there are different article types, from original research article, electronic media, atypical articles, posters, research letters, blogs, and supplements, and they all have different guidelines that have to be adhered to. So the managing editor has to become quite familiar with all of these guidelines. Obviously, you can hold up the guideline and have it side by side the actual manuscript and create checklists for yourself to make sure that these guidelines are being met before you can say, I either need to desk reject or I need to send it to the associate editor and the next step of the peer review process. The associate editor. Once the manuscript lands on your desk, your job is to read that manuscript, and then you're checking for its overall fit for the journal. Does it fit within the intersection of public health, health equity, health justice, social justice? Okay. If so, then you can decide, I'm going to send this to reviewers, right? At a minimum of 2 reviewers, and then obviously use the templates that we have to be able to make sure that reviewers know at what time frame they need to be able to look at these reviews. Okay. After they get the reviews back, their job is to be, if in fact most of the reviewers have said revise and resubmit, they then send a message to the author that says, we are wanting you to revise and resubmit. You have to not only send us the manuscript with track changes, but then also the manuscript without those track changes. And then the third piece of what you've actually done in terms of revisions. So 3 pieces in the revise and resubmit: the manuscript with track changes, the manuscript without track changes, as well as a document that says these are the things that we've incorporated, or these are the things that we've omitted and decided not to address in the revision. And then after that, if a decision is ultimately made for accept or reject, that is the purview of the associate editor. When they send out that accept or reject, that is CC to all the co-editors in chief, so we are aware of what is happening. The associate editor also bumped things up if they are not sure whether or not to accept, reject, or revise or resubmit. And so that usually happens when an associate editor is just getting started in the process, but over time they have a certain level of confidence of what is acceptable for the journal. And then, as we've gone over before, the reviewer, your job is to read the manuscript, address all aspects of the manuscript that we described, all the way from abstract to references, figures, and tables. And then you make the decision, accept, or reject, or revise. But you recommend that, because ultimately the person pushing the button for accept, reject, or revise and resubmit is the associate editor. So you, as a reviewer, fill out the rubric, make the recommendation, but ultimately the job of making that final decision is the associate editors. So initial manuscript assessment. So for the associate editor, right, what is the scope and relevance of this manuscript? And I've actually included things in hyperlinks, health equity and social justice, in case you're not as familiar with those aspects. And so you can actually toggle to the pages on BCPHR. So we go over how can you be able to assess that not only is this manuscript covering public health, but is it also covering an aspect of health equity or social justice? And if it doesn't, how can I help to encourage the author and authors to be able to incorporate this information? The majority of manuscripts, if they don't already incorporate, they can be easily guided to do so. And then you're also looking for the clarity and structure for that manuscript, and then its overall rigor, its originality, the validity of its methodology, and the accuracy of its analysis. And this is just revisiting again. We're absolutely ingraining this into an exceptional review is timely, anywhere from 4 days to 2 weeks. It's clear, it's easy to read and interpret by the authors and authors. It's helpful, it's constructive, a balance of positive and negative comments that are relevant and that are realistic and that they can be acted upon anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks for the authors or authors, and is comprehensive as being able to incorporate all aspects of the academic manuscript and not just focusing too much on the methodology or the figures or the results, but all aspects of it. And so when you're thinking about how do I evaluate the abstract, the things that you want to look for is making sure that it's clear and it's brief. Abstracts shouldn't be overly long. They should, adhere to a certain word limit, but nonetheless be able to give you a good snapshot and purview of the entire manuscript coming forward. You want to make sure that you have all the key elements, especially if it's a quantitative research paper, that the abstract is touching on the research objective, the methodology, the key findings, and the significance, and making sure that it's relevant and accurate. There are times when abstracts are written and they actually don't do the whole snapshot. They actually may overly focus on one aspect of the paper, or they may have missing gaps of the paper as well. So it's an incomplete snapshot, or it's something that really is off the mark. And so making sure that abstract is appropriate is one of the first things that you can do. And assessing the introduction, you want to make sure that it has appropriate context and relevance. It's really outlining the research problem and being able to cover as many bases as possible, but within a short period of time. And it's really showing what is the significance of this problem in general. Why should we even do this? Are we doing this that's truly original? Why is this going to matter overall for public health and health equity and health justice research? And then making sure that the objectives of the introduction are outlined as well. What were the aims and hypotheses if it's a quantitative paper, if it's a qualitative paper, and how is it going to be logically linked to the broader academic context? And reviewing the methodology section, make sure that you're asking yourself and commenting on the following questions: whether or not the research methodology is clearly described and whether or not it can be replicated based off the description. Is it appropriate method for actually addressing the research objective, or is there a different type of methodology that can be done? This is where things get a little tricky, because if you feel that the research methodology is significantly inappropriate for the research being conducted, that might actually lead to an ultimate desk rejection, because if the authors are not able to change their research within 2 to 4 weeks, then ultimately we won't be able to accept them within a certain time period. You also want to ask yourself whether or not the methods aligned with established practices for this type of research, and whether or not they can ensure credible results. And the data sources, the sampling techniques, and the tools are specified and actually justified within this section itself. And ethical guidelines are followed and described if necessary. And then also limitations of the methods are at least briefly acknowledged in this part. In terms of analyzing the results, you want to be able to ask yourself and comment on, are these results presented clearly and logically and appropriately referencing tables, graphs, or figures within the manuscript itself? Do the results align with the research objectives and hypotheses? Do the statistical analyses make sense from an accuracy standpoint or validity standpoint? And are any anomalies or unexpected findings addressed and explained appropriately? And is there sufficient detail to support the conclusions that come later? The other thing that we wanted to implement with the BCPHR is recommending any visual media that might be enhancing. And so there are some manuscripts that come in and they already actually have visual media to be able to make the work more digestible, but sometimes they don't, or sometimes it's limited. And so as a peer reviewer, it is also up to you to recommend a variety of different things that may enhance the research, for the reader. So thinking about the audience, are there pie charts? Are there tables, scatter plots, bar charts, flow charts, or other types of things that can be added to the manuscript that can really enhance it for our readers? Because we want to be able to make it very digestible, even for a precocious 14 or 15-year-old who's actually reading our journal. And as we know, many college students actually reference our journal and use our journal to be able to write their papers in their public health courses in undergrad as well as for graduate school. In evaluating the discussion, things that you want to ask yourself and then also comment on is whether or not the results are being clearly interpreted, or are they being interpreted in a way that it supports potential bias that the author or authors may have had. And are the findings of the paper actually contextualized within the existing literature? We do find with a lot of emerging authors that they may not necessarily do that. So this is a key area to look for that can frequently be missed within BCPH first-time authors. And are they addressing the implications of the results, not only for their own research, but research within the field, policy, as well as practice? And are they addressing the implications for health equity, health justice, as well as social justice? It's another area that oftentimes we find manuscripts don't necessarily do automatically. So it's a great way to be able to provide an actionable insight for our authors. And once again, are the limitations of the study acknowledged from the research methodology to the time frame to other aspects that might have actually limited the generalizability of their research? And assessing references. Ultimately, the managing editor is supposed to be able to determine if all the references are in fact in AMA 11th edition. However, as the reviewer, it's a good idea to keep an eye on these just in case things fell through the cracks so that we can make sure that all of these things are formatted appropriately. And then also make sure that these are credible, relevant, up-to-date sources. So looking at things where they were published, going through one by one and making sure that these in fact are reputable sources. If they're not, then recommending to the author more reputable sources that can be found. And it's okay to recommend anywhere from 1 to 6 additional sources. We don't want to overload the author or authors by recommending 20 sources because that might be difficult to be able to incorporate into their research, but recommending anywhere from 1 to 6 can be helpful, especially if it helps to enrich the introduction or enrich and expand upon their discussion. So providing constructive feedback. As you're doing more of these reviews, you may decide that you want to have a template of how you provide feedback for any of the given sections. And so I have a couple examples here as well, and how you might provide constructive feedback for the introductions, the methodology, the results, as well as the discussion. And I'll have you read that on your own time. And then final check, the grammar and clarity check. So don't get bogged down with doing a review and focusing on grammar and clarity at the beginning. Go through and look at the substance of the paper first before you then finally come to the grammar and the clarity and coherence of the paper. And so when you're looking at the final aspects of it, obviously looking at sentence structure, at punctuation, but other things you might want to keep in mind as well as active voice and making sure that there's not an over-reliance of passive voice. Frequently, that passive voice can predominate in academic literature, but actually trying to encourage the active voice for readers can actually ultimately help with the audience because it is easier to read. And then making sure that you're noticing any camouflage verbs. So this comes with overly long and complicated sentences that happen frequently in academia, but making sure if we have overly long nouns, can we actually turn those into verbs, and recommend that obviously to our authors. And then hedging, if there's unnecessary uncertainty or equivocating within it. Obviously, there are times when an author and authors cannot necessarily say 100% certain things. However, if there is unnecessary hedging, it is important that you can point that out as another thing for the author to be able to improve the overall clarity of their work. So BCPH rubric. So as you know, when you did the example review, we do have a rubric. So get very familiar with this as a peer reviewer. So we have a rating scale of 1 to 5. The authors are able to see that rating scale. Obviously, 1 is that it is a fairly low review. And we think that because either the accuracy, the validity, the research methodology, the strength of the introduction and discussion might be very low, or the references may be outdated. and or not relevant for the topic at hand. And then the 5-star is that it is great across the board in terms of all of the sections, the balanced arguments presented, and its overall thoroughness and digestibleness in terms of figures and tables, etc. You will have a section to comment to the editor. This is actually not seen by the authors. However, it is something that can be there. So when you're doing this on your own, whatever you put in there, this is the thing that the associate editor will then look on, be able to discern if you're deciding to accept, reject, or revise and resubmit. They look to this box to be able to determine why you might be saying that. We also have a rating scale in terms of whether or not a manuscript is professionally written, whether or not it's objective and it's thorough, and whether or not it makes a contribution to scholarship. Authors are able to see this as well, and this is something that's taken into account by the associate editor to determine whether or not they really want to be able to revise and resubmit, accept, or reject a manuscript. And then there's other commentary as well in terms of, is the content appropriate for the journal? And even though the associate editor, in a very broad sense, determined whether or not they thought it was appropriate, you can drill much deeper as a peer editor in terms of what it's covering. Sometimes it might be an article that purely covers public health. And so you may say that it is in some ways appropriate, but if these things about health equity or health justice are incorporated, it would be an even better fit. And then also the clarity and coherence of it. This is where you can talk about, is the argument balanced? Is it biased to one direction versus another? Is certain types of literature, certain types of arguments left out of the discussion? So you can mention that here. And then discussing the implications for research policy and practice, as we mentioned before, not just for their own research, but also in general for local policy, governmental policy, and sometimes international policy and or practice. And then comments to the author, points that can help them. So this is the very actionable advice that you would need to give them. Now, even though they'll see the implications for research policy practice, whether or not you think they're clear and coherent, whether they're relevant for the journal, this is the box, the comments to the author to strengthen it, that they're going to look at, that they're really going to be able to decide, what do I need to do to my manuscript the next 2 to 4 weeks to make it ready, and more suitable for publication. So make sure that you number this 1, 2, 3, 4, and that these are things that they can take immediate response to. So as I mentioned before, it is the recommendation from the peer reviewer to accept, reject, revise, and resubmit. The associate editor absolutely makes that decision, though. They push the button for accept, reject, revise, and resubmit. So why do we accept anything to the Boston Congress of Public Health review? And so ultimately, if the manuscript is meeting our standards for public health, health equity, health justice, it's addressing a significant original research question, it's requiring only minor edits. And even though those edits, there may be 30 different things that you want them to edit or incorporate. If they're things, as I said before, that are just a matter of grammar, of clarity, of strengthened arguments, or incorporation of anywhere from 1 to 6 additional references, then it is something that is appropriate, that may be accepted after a revise and resubmit. If something is rejected by BCPHR, that means that there are fundamental flaws in the study design, the methodology, the analysis, or the grammar, the clarity, or the references are so significantly behind that it would require more than one revision. In that case, instead of going through multiple revisions, which we do not do, we only have one round of revisions with BCPHR at this time. At that point, that would be a recommendation for a reject. And revise and resubmit basically follows if we feel that it mostly meets the journal standards and only one round of substantial revisions needed to address any content gaps or specific methodological issues, then that would be a revise and resubmit. So confidentiality, impartiality, timeliness, and constructive feedback, these are all considerations when we're thinking about from an ethics perspective, because as a peer reviewer, it's not just content and strength of arguments that you're looking at, it's also things that are done in the appropriate fashion. So as a peer reviewer, it's important to, even though you're downloading these manuscripts, that you're not sharing them. That would be a violation of the author's privacy as well as the code for BCPHR. So all of this should remain confidential. You do not share manuscripts and you do not share reviews with anyone. You keep all of that either on your personal computer and then delete it after you're done with the review and keep everything within Scholastica. That you're not looking at manuscripts of people that you know within your network to see what their reviews are, to see what stage that they're in the process, that you recognize what potential conflicts of interest there are, and then let the co-editors in chief know what those conflicts of interest may be. As a reviewer, you want to make sure that you're avoiding bias when you're reviewing manuscripts and that there's no personal, financial, or professional conflicts of interest, as I mentioned before. Your feedback is respectful, it's actionable, and it's unbiased. It's meant to strengthen the manuscript, and it's done to make it more accessible, it more readable, and it more impactful. So just as a reminder again, so as a managing editor, you're confirming the guidelines as set by BCPHR, you're checking for plagiarism, and you're scanning for overt AI overuse. You either desk reject a manuscript or you push it on to the associate editor. As the associate editor, you're reading the manuscript, you're checking for overall journal fit. You actually don't need to write anything down. So I may not have said this before, but the associate editor is just reading and checking for fit. But then when you're writing to the reviewers, you're not giving your commentary. You're basically just asking them to review this manuscript. And then once the reviews come in, you're reading all of those reviews, you're reading any revisions that the author or authors have made. And then from that standpoint, you're deciding, do we need to accept or reject this manuscript? And finally, as a reviewer, you're reading the manuscript, you're assessing all aspects of the manuscript, and you are recommending, do we accept, reject, or recommend, revise, and resubmit? Recommendations. And that is it for this lecture. Look forward to seeing you all shortly.